Hey y'all, it's Keifer. Before we get into today's episode, I have some quick bad news and good news. The bad news is I was laid off last week. This came completely without notice, and I'm still sort of finding my footing among everything. That part isn't great. On a personal level, do not worry about me. I spend a lot of time on the show talking about how capitalism is strip mining the value of everything at an accelerated rate, so I was prepared for something like this to happen, even if it did happen suddenly. I'm going to be okay. But if you want to help me out while I'm in between full time jobs, I'd certainly appreciate it. As I say every episode, you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/Kiefer's Corner. Check the link in the description. Just $1 a month gets you early access to new episodes, as well as longer versions of episodes, including the one you're listening to now. And going off that a little bit, with my new affliction of free time, I plan on adding more perks in the very near future. This is including exclusive bonuses that will only appear on the Patreon feed. This would be stuff that breaks from the traditional format, my thoughts on recent games I've played, some stuff with guests, possibly an AMA. I'm even thinking about doing bonuses for movies and TV shows. So if you like the show and want to hear more of me, definitely join the Patreon. So that's the good news. I have some more time to work on the show. And if you're interested in helping me out, I deeply appreciate it while I figure out my job situation. And hey, you can benefit from it by hearing more of me if that's something you like. If you can't afford to join, that is more than okay. There's plenty of ways you can help me and the show. If you haven't already, please make sure you leave a positive review on whatever platform you use to listen to the show. The more 5-star reviews a show has, the more likely it is to appear in other people's recommendations, which means more people listen to the show. You can also post about the podcast on whatever service you use to communicate with people. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, Blue Sky, Discord, Telegram, Tumblr, Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, Raya, anything helps really. Show it to your friends, show it to your family, show it to your cat. Anything helps. Thank you to everyone supporting Select and Start. The fact that there are people out there listening to me is the most incredible feeling in the world. Just giving your time to me means more than you'll ever know. Thank you. Getting laid off while I was editing a podcast about Night in the Woods, of all things, is honestly one of the funniest things that's ever happened to me. It sucks, but the irony is not lost on me. It is cosmically hilarious. I was worried that people would find it weird I was covering a work that people so strongly associate with autumn, right as it's about to be summer. But this game is more than its aesthetic, and while it is a game that clearly comes from a deeply personal place, it hits on some pretty universal ideas about labor issues, community, and our responsibility to care for one another. That quote from Angus, where he talks about a universe that doesn't care and people who do, has definitely been rattling around in my head over the past few days. But that's getting ahead of myself. Let's get to the show. All right, I think that's it. Enjoy listening to this episode about a game that shows us the incredible power of listening. Hello, and welcome to Select and Start, the podcast about meaningful and memorable video games. I'm your host, Keifer, and every episode I bring on a guest who selects a game that made an impact on their life. I have yet another wonderful guest with me today. He is a writer whose works can be seen in multiple outlets, as well as the author of Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic Oral History, published on paperback by Boss Fights Book. It's Alex Kane. Alex, how are you today?
Hey, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely happy to have you on. I'd really appreciate you making time to be on my humble podcast here. For the people who don't have the pleasure of knowing you, Alex, what do you do and what do you like?
Well, in my day job, I'm a senior editor at a large newspaper company doing sort of updates writing and things like that and SEO. But I still write about games for fun on the side. I was a full-time freelancer from 2014 through January of 2021. So for like 7 years, I was, hustling as a games journalist and copy editor and was a slush reader for some online publications and things like that. Games and writing about games is a lot more fun than when I was doing it to make rent and pay the bills. So that's kind of a fun irony of having kind of a sort of boring 9 to 5 day job these days. I actually I enjoy games a lot more than when they were my job, which is very strange. But I still try to write about them any chance I get. I recently got offered my second book contract, so hopefully we'll be able to talk about that someday far in the future. But
Mhm.
I love movies. I collect DVDs with what tiny disposable income I have, which isn't much these days when you got kids and everything. It's impossible to afford to live. But as a dad, I enjoy sort of corrupting my 7-year-old with like the games and the movies that I grew up loving and grew up interested in. So that takes up a lot of my time. I'm a big fan of horror and John Carpenter and Stephen King and things like that. A few years ago, I sort of wrote a very bad screenplay and things like that. So, big fan of like Star Wars and Halo and comic books and Fallout, and yeah, sort of grew up watching things like The Twilight Zone, and so I that's sort of still the kind of stuff that interests me today. And I've been reading like the Dragon Ball manga ever since Toriyama died. I've been getting back into that stuff and revisiting all those old Dragon Ball Z movies that I grew up watching, and about to start season 3 of Dragon Ball Z with my son on Blu-ray. So it's kind of weird watching that stuff like decades later, we'll say. But yeah, I enjoy writing. I like the creative side of things. I like interviewing people, kind of like you do, apparently. I like, I like talking to game developers and like telling the story of like, how things are made. I love reading memoirs by like artists and artist types, like actors, things like that. Just hearing about miserable creative people trying to create and be less miserable, that's the kind of stuff that I love. I love the Star Wars documentary, The Beginning, where George Lucas is like, "Oh, I haven't made a film in decades. Let's get this Star Wars thing going again." And yeah, I love like the behind the scenes stories of books and games and films and TV shows and things like that.
Right, yeah, that totally squares with your, you having just written that, boss fight books, thing on Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic. That's behind the scenes stuff, it's interviewing, it's Star Wars, and you're right at home with all those interests, of course. I'm a big collector of, movies. I've been doing the boutique, Blu-ray collection stuff with, Kino Lorber's and the Criterion Collection, buying those on sale, of course, paying full
Yeah.
prices. Silly, but, it's a great way to build up a collection 'cause, big into physical media, as evidenced by my whole like tirade I go on every episode about preservation. I feel the same way about all the stuff you talked about. A couple episodes ago, I talked about Dragon Ball Z at length with the previous Alex I had on the show. Where we talked about Super Mario RPG, and that was
Mm.
recorded before Toriyama passed away. It was like
Ah,
days or before, so like it was just totally organic.
wonderful.
But yeah, no, thank you so much for that thorough introduction. You talked about all these interests that you like, sci-fi, John Carpenter, Twilight Zone, things of that nature. And then you alluded to some video games that you like Halo and Fallout. So let's talk about video games specifically a little bit here. As we know, no community likes to gatekeep more than the gamers. So we have to check your gaming credentials here at the top. Let's talk a bit about your gaming history, who or what got you into it, your relationship with it throughout the years, and so on. What is Alex's portrait of a gamer?
Yeah, that's interesting. I had a job at a department store called Shopco, and I was hired on as a cashier in like 2007, 2008. I wound up getting put in the electronics department eventually, but my first day there, I met this guy named Carl who they had hired to do the electronics job that I would eventually sort of fall into. He was somebody who liked to get a read on people and put them into categories. And he goes, "Alex, you look like a gamer." And I was kind of offended at the time. I was like, what does he mean by that? I felt very much not a gamer for many, many years, is the point of that. I've been a casual gamer my entire life since I was like 4, probably.
Right.
So I started with the NES. I played Super Mario Brothers 3 with my dad, and then like my sisters and I played through Mario Brothers 2 and then Mario Brothers 1, kind of going backwards. We'd play games like Section Z. Dr. Mario, Batman, like the 1989 Batman game,
Yeah.
which had like a fabulous soundtrack, I think is the main reason I liked it. Jurassic Park and Spy Hunter. But the N64 was really kind of ground zero. Super Mario 64. I was, 7 years old when that came out in North America. And like to go from being a kid who played like Super Mario Brothers 3 and Spy Hunter on the NES and not really having access to the Super NES except occasionally at like friends' houses, to make that leap from the NES to Super Mario 64 was like a quasi-religious revelation. Okay, like I'm almost 35, so it was definitely like a moment in time for people who really care about like the art of video games as you do. It was the camera and the sense of like bodies of water having volume and being kind of frightening and like these creatures like moving in sort of naturalistic ways. Obviously they don't seem that way now. I'm not afraid of the eel or like the things in Mario 64 these days, but like as a kid that stuff was pretty terrifying, and I was just in awe of like the Loch Ness monster little vignette and just all the stuff that game had to offer.
Talking about like Super Mario 64, I think like in movie terms, I think that might be as close as like video games has gotten to like their Wizard of Oz moment, where we have like this understanding of the medium, and then suddenly Dorothy emerges into the Oz, and then suddenly, oh shit, color, what the fuck? And that's
Yeah.
kind of like what the idea of the 3D gaming might have been.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the PS2 had Final Fantasy X, and when I saw Final Fantasy X for the first time in like 2000, when I was like 9, 10 years old or something like that, it was absolutely like jaw-dropping seeing Final Fantasy X for the first time. It was almost like seeing Super Mario 64 like a decade earlier or years earlier. It wasn't actually that long ago though, right? It was like 96 and then 2000. So it was only 4 years apart,
Yeah.
really.
And I mean, then like even between all that, you have the FMV sequences in Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 that are breathtaking by those standards. And we're doing things like transitioning seamlessly in PS1 sense from cutscene to FMV sequence. But yeah.
The original Xbox, it was kind of where I really sunk my teeth into like exploring different kinds of games and like I kind of felt like an Xbox guy, and like, when I was 11 or so, 12, when the Xbox came out, and was like, okay, had never had a PlayStation, and I didn't have a GameCube either for that matter. So I was sort of this kid who still had the N64, and I was mowing a lot of lawns and saving up money with the intention of buying a GameCube for like Star Fox and Wind Waker and Luigi's Mansion. That never happened because Halo happened, and then so I ended up getting an Xbox when the price dropped by $100, like right as I was about to buy a GameCube. I think that the Xbox was like $100 more than the PS2 or something, and so the Xbox dropped to match it. And that was like, okay, well, that's where Halo is. That's where I want to be. So I ended up getting an Xbox and discovering games like Morrowind, Splinter Cell, Knights of the Old Republic, all these tie-in games that I loved, like Robotech Battle Cry and the Minority Report game that Treyarch made back before their Call of Duty days. That was kind of awful and janky, but I just adored it. And I mean, there were so many good games on the original Xbox, Red Dead Revolver and Max Payne, Dead to Rights. Like, there were just so many great games on the original Xbox. That was where I really got into reading like Xbox Magazine. And I think even back in those days, I think I probably had a hint of like, oh, it'd be cool to write for a magazine like this one day. During college, the college years was sort of the Xbox 360 era from my point of view. And that was sort of when I played games the least, because I was very into becoming a writer. I wanted to be a serious writer, I wanted to be the next Stephen King or William Gibson or whoever the hell. So like watching TV and playing video games was sort of like stuff that I wasn't allowing myself to do that much.
Who has the time in college, you know?
Yeah. So in college, it was like, homework, girlfriend, maybe watch a movie once in a while, go to bed, rinse, repeat. I worked a lot of hours in part-time jobs during college as well. That's sort of like a defining thing about me, is that I've like had a job since like within 2 months of turning 16, and I've pretty much been working ever since. So
The grind
I'm
set.
like I'm like very like grumpy and cynical about like work culture and stuff. And I'm about to turn 35, and I'm like, do I get to retire yet? So that's just a little thing about me, I guess, that factors into a game like Night in the Woods that maybe we'll talk about later.
Yep.
But during college, it was Guitar Hero, a lot of Halo, a lot of Call of Duty, and of course Red Dead Redemption was like the big game on the 360 for me. That was kind of like, oh wow, yeah, I still love these things. And then after college, I got really back into gaming in a big way in 2014. There was sort of like a trifecta of games that sort of ruined my life in 2014. Titanfall, Wind Waker HD, and Destiny. What kind of happened there is that I went to a writing workshop. I lost 2 grandparents. Like, my dad's parents both passed away within a very short window of time. And so it was like the writing workshop mixed with like the grief and like the burnout of not wanting to work like a crummy retail job for the rest of eternity, all kind of it sort of added up into me throwing myself into these games, and particularly Destiny when that came around. And so you can sort of see where that would go in terms of career and things like that.
You were talking about earlier how you have this sort of relationship with video games for a while where you sort of balk at the idea of like being considered a gamer. Now, of course, you're on a video game podcast. So, arc of history, et cetera, et cetera. But you eventually began writing about video games. What was that journey like, getting into that?
It was like this confluence of things, right? Where I had always loved games. I'd played games my whole life, but I quit my retail banking job to pursue writing seriously and freelancing seriously and try to kind of, figure out how do I make money on my own and not sort of work the 9 to 5 grind forever and ever, and see what I can make happen in the world of writing and publishing and things like that. And I didn't have kids at that time, so I could be sort of reckless and I could take a risk, right? And so in May of 2014, I got a freelance gig copy editing a book of film criticism for some small press, which that guy still owes me a lot of money. He sort of fell off the face of the planet, but that's besides the point. Anyway, I think he owes me like 18 grand, but it's fine.
If you can find that person out there listening.
But
continue.
In this twisted way, I'm sort of really grateful to that guy because he sort of hired this like nobody guy who was like, hey, I'm available for copy editing clients. And he was the first one. And, I got the first check for like $1,700 from copy editing this book, put in my 2 weeks at my job, and, off I went. Right. So, there were more books for him to copy edit. I went out to GameStop and I bought the Zelda Wind Waker Edition Wii U with a little bit of that money from that freelance gig to kind of celebrate, and kind of like as an early birthday gift to myself is kind of what I said at the time. And I kind of threw myself into that game as a way to kind of cope with, like I said, I had lost the 2 grandparents who meant a lot to me a few months before that. And the fact that Wind Waker has Link's grandmother in it, and that you return to her and in your journey, and she like makes soup for you, and that's what heals you, that like had such an impact on me at the time. I was like, wow, this really affects me. It really means something that Link has a grandma. She's cooking this soup. That's a sort of way that grandmothers express their love, is they'll order you a pizza or they'll make chili or what have you. As we all know, they'll bake a pumpkin pie or whatever. So yeah, I got really into Wind Waker. I got really into Magic the Gathering for a while, for a couple years. And then being the Halo / Knights of the Old Republic fan that I was, when Destiny came along in September of 2014, I was like, oh no, like this game is like, no game has ever looked more like my shit than Destiny 1. And yeah, it kind of just ruined me. So it came out, I spent the first like 3 or 4 days playing it with an old work buddy. I mentioned Shopco earlier. We worked together at Shopco. Really funny guy named Lance and a couple of his buddies. We played Destiny, nonstop for like 3 days, beat the campaign and all that, and played a bunch of Crucible. Basically, I was, dreaming about Destiny when I slept at night. And so, it was like, how do I make these two things, my renewed love of video games, the rediscovery of all the meaning that can be found in them, and also this desire to become a professional writer and write like novels and things. So, it's like, okay, I should pitch like a book on video games, or I should write for these video game sites like Polygon and Kotaku and all those places. Eventually, I sort of cold emailed an editor at Killscreen about doing news for them. That worked out really well. Those editors that I met there got me work at Rolling Stone's gaming vertical Glixel. And those clips in turn got me work at StarWars.com and Variety and all these other places. So it was just really like following that curiosity and kind of letting myself be lost in these games, which is really easy to do when you are freelance. You can sort of afford to work like a madman for 2 weeks straight and then take 2 weeks off, which is what I was doing. And at the height of my sort of Destiny, obsession.
Right. Your 20s.
Yeah. Yeah. The 20s. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Sounds like you're like the first person who was like writing got me into video games instead of the other way around, because you used that first paycheck to get a Wii U.
Yeah, it was weird. I mean, I'd always loved video games and been
Right.
playing them, but it was
That like obsession that like got you into like the deep into it.
kind of like a way to legitimize it,
Yeah.
I sort of started watching TV when I found out like that other writers I admired were into TV, and was like, oh, okay, it's like fair game to watch Hannibal and Breaking Bad, So
Right. That was like the height of like the quote unquote golden era of TV, where you had your Breaking Bad, your Mad Men, Hannibal stuff, Fargo, all that airing on TV at once.
yeah. But, I mean, I had always loved the games that I had loved, but I think that when I sort of read, some of the early boss fight books and read Kill Screen and some of the, more personal stuff on places like Polygon, I was like, okay, this is a legitimate outlet for, all this Destiny I'm playing and things like that. So, it was kind of a meandering, slow journey into actually doing that and getting paid to do it. But here we are 8 years later, more than 8 years later. And I'm,
A decade.
people are asking me to, contribute like chapters and essays to books. And, I just got offered a second book contract that might be related to video games. Who knows? Yeah. I wrote a documentary for IGN recently about the history of Bethesda games and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's paid off, like just sort of giving into that love and not sort of fighting the. I played a really stupid amount of Destiny for a few years and have like 4,300 hours in those two games, but it led me to do a lot of thinking about why someone would play 4,300 hours of Destiny, and why Wind Waker meant so much to me, and why Minecraft affected me the way it did, or the Halo games and things like that. So,
Right. And, you've been writing this sort of 10-year love letter to the medium. What would you say the work you're most proud of is?
I've done a bunch of oral histories, and I guess the book is one of those, really, the KOTOR book. But the Morrowind oral history I did for Polygon in 2019, it was sort of the side project I would do while I was writing my book to kind of procrastinate and not have to look at my book for a little bit. I would do Morrowind interviews and transcribe those and put that together on the side. And it wound up being almost as long as the book. Like, not quite, but it's like 22,000 words. So it's
Wow.
quite an epic read for people
I'll
who
link
sit
that in
down.
the, yeah.
and it's taught in like college game dev courses, and people all over the industry read it and shared it when it came out. And if you're a writer, you're really lucky if that happens one time in your career, that people like actually take notice of something and love it and share it. And that was just like a one of a kind, joyous moment in my life, that everyone was reading that Morrowind oral history for like, a few days. So yeah, sometimes I'll pull that up myself and reread it for inspiration, because some of the things that they say about games and game development and creativity and world building, it's nothing I did that made that oral history great. Really, I got the luckiest interviews ever in my career, out of 8+ years of doing this kind of thing. I talked to Ken Ralston, the lead designer of Morrowind. I talked
Mhm.
to Michael Kirkbride, who is one of like maybe two people who came up with like a lot of the really weird sort of cosmological world building of the Elder Scrolls universe. I talked to Todd Howard. It was surreal. I just got really, really lucky with that project. And at any moment, Bethesda PR could have said, oh, Todd doesn't want to talk to you anymore or whatever, but it just worked out and they gave me gold. And so I guess if there's anything that I'm really proud of that feels like it might stand the test of time, I'd love that to be in like a print edition or something, because it is online, which makes me nervous, because I've been in this business long enough to know that when something's online, it can kind of vanish. But I know that article kind of struck a nerve with some people, so that was cool.
That's good to know. I mean, give yourself some credit there in the sense that the art of organizing something and presentation is so much of that stuff too. But like being able to have that kind of access and be able to tell the story of such a monumental game, that is an immense privilege. And I'm glad that that is like a source of pride for you. Knowing what I know about the Destiny series, it's not something I've engaged with much. It's something I've absorbed passively through, college dorms at the time when I was going to college from 2014 to 2018. So I don't really know too much about it, but I understand that some of the content of it has like sort of warped or changed or no longer exists as it was on the original disc. What is that like, and what are your thoughts on how they've handled that availability of content in the game that is living?
Yeah, so that's one of the things that bothers me about Destiny 2 specifically. Is Destiny 1, you can pretty much play, I think, everything that was in that game. Comparatively, it had a lot less content than Destiny 2. In Destiny 2, you can't play the vanilla base campaign, the quote unquote Red War. You can't play Forsaken, which was arguably like the best or one of the best parts of Destiny 2. Like, neither of those two campaigns are playable right now. I don't know if there's any way of doing it if you're like some kind of a hacker modder type person. I still don't think you can do it. So that's very interesting and unfortunate. And my sort of big secret hope is that they'll unlock all that stuff after the final shape storyline kind of settles,
Mhm.
because they're doing a lot of weird stuff with the lore about how like uh, Destiny is very weird. They do this like paracausality thing, which is like, the end is the beginning and the light is the dark and all this weird bullshit about, you know, um, so like it's twisting reality, and you can sort of go into these places that will be familiar to us from like earlier stories in the new, like the conclusion, but it'll be kind of this fun house mirror reality, which is maybe like hell, like heaven/hell. I don't know. There's all kinds of theories about what it actually is. So I think that they'll use that as an excuse to bring back that early content of like vanilla Destiny 2 and Forsaken, but who knows? I mean, they've been so kind of firm in their reasoning for not including that stuff, but when the game is sort of finished, whatever that means, then they won't have to hopefully balance stuff as much anymore, and then that'll kind of remove the reasoning for removing it. I don't know. It would be nice to see them treat it the way like Master Chief Collection and like Warzone or Call of Duty Modern Warfare does, where you can kind of say, I want to install like these 5 things, or I don't want to install these 2 things. And
Right, like Street Fighter 6, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you don't want 2 or 300 gigabytes of a game on your hard drive, like, it would be nice to just install the, the old Destiny 2 content that you wanna revisit, so we'll
Mhm.
see if we get to do that, I don't know. I'd love
Yeah,
to see that happen.
I appreciate you, explaining that and, like, going into your feelings on that for me because that is, like, a very interesting case of, like, game preservation, which is like this big pervasive issue where the
Mhm.
vast majority of the games are not like accessible by legitimate means, and there's a living game that has been iterated upon for the past decade, where parts of it are being streamlined and removed. So I was just like, thank you for your providing your thoughts on that. You've talked about how the Xbox has sort of followed you throughout your defining years. Would you say that series of consoles is your favorite console, or what would you say your favorite console is?
If you ask me to name one console, I'm tempted to say the original Xbox. It was kind of the moment where I kind of grew up with games a little bit. That was sort of my adolescence. I think that Halo was really profound for me, and Halo 2 was sort of a way that I, made friends, like lifelong friendships and things like that. So, and then of course, games like Morrowind and Knights of the Old Republic, I'm writing like these long form reported things about them like decades later. So hard not to think of the original Xbox as kind of like, the one that defines me, I guess, even though the N64 was a big deal. The Xbox One, obviously, in like 2014 and 15, and 17 for that matter, the sort of 2010s was very foundational for me in my sort of quote unquote career. But
Mhm.
yeah, the original Xbox is kind of the one that I sort of have the warm fuzzy feelings about all these years later.
Yeah, it's a perspective I really appreciate because I don't get that one a lot. A lot of people who consider themselves, like the game lovers have like, a lot of there's different backgrounds. I think Nintendo is the one that probably comes up most often, or like early Sony games and things like that. But I appreciate this perspective because it is obviously one that has defined your professional career, but it is also one that has given you some of your most valuable experiences. Talking about the list of games that you presented to me as options to talk about on the show, you gave me Halo 2, Destiny, Friday the 13th, the game, Minecraft. Those are all big Xbox games. Obviously, most of those are multi-platform experiences, but they do feel like core Xbox multiplayer experiences for a lot of people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially Halo 2, and I guess Halo 3 was sort of the bigger one, but I Halo 2 has always been the one that I consider the best one and the one that meant so much to me as a multiplayer game, but also as a total package. The soundtrack and the campaign, and I think the Arbiter is my favorite Halo character, and so that sort of divisive, controversial choice to make him, like the viewpoint character, essentially. I love replaying Halo 2 over and over the years. So
Kill me or release me, parasite. But do not waste my time with talk.
but yeah, I mean, Halo is kind of the thing that's always been there game wise. That was even in college when I was sort of like not playing games so much, I'd come back for Halo Reach, I'd come back for Halo 4 and so on. So
Yeah. Definitely appreciate you going into the Halo stuff a little bit there for me. Now, Friday the 13th was another game that you pitched there, and that is an interesting one because I do know that the people who love that game, but I haven't heard anybody present that to me as a game to talk about in the show yet. So, what are your feelings on Friday the 13th, and why did it connect with you so much?
well, I think people in my generation or your generation, I think we're sort of like on the I'm on one end of millennial and you're on the other end of the zennials, perhaps. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
I'm 28 this year, so
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So you're sort of like the older range of that generation, and I'm sort of the younger range of millennials, I guess. But
I have like a theory that like I think the thing that like divides like people my age born in like 1996 from like Zoomers is really just like, did you have older brothers or not? Because if you did, I feel like you're probably on the more millennial side of thing, or older siblings, I should say,
oh, sure,
because
yeah, yeah.
the established stuff that is in the house versus like you being the first child in the home is probably going to be completely different. But that's a completely different tangent. Continue.
One of the sort of defining experiences I think for us or a lot of people is making friendships online. So like people that you've never met, that you nowadays it's like happens all the time through like Twitter or what have you. But in 2017, I had a film critic I had added as a friend on Xbox Live at some point. We never played anything together. And then Friday the 13th, the game came out. I was reviewing it for Glixel, playing a bunch of it. And then a horror film critic, or a film critic who really loved horror, shot me an invite, because he saw I was on and he needed somebody to fill a lobby or whatever. So I find myself in this private Friday the 13th lobby with just all these sort of like-minded writers, geeks, filmmakers, and even an actor from a film that I was a big fan of in college. I was like, wait a minute. I'm like, wait a minute. They're calling him by this first name, and he sounds an awful lot like. And sure enough, that's who it was. And so it was just kind of this surreal thing of like making a friend group online through a video game. I had never really experienced that before. And, it's 7 years later and we're still playing Friday the 13th, the game, in a group, on Fridays occasionally. So that's been really kind of profound and meaningful for me. It was kind of the first horror game that I really fell in love with, because I love like multiplayer games. I love that sort of competitive, like, let me try to master this sort of janky, unruly thing that is a, third person action game online with like a lot of bugs and a lot of sort of weird like role playing and like hide and go seek mechanics and things like that. Like it's a very kind of unique beast, and certainly it was a unique beast at the time, because it's combining all these different influences and putting like a horror coat of paint on it. And I've always been a big fan of like slasher films. I mentioned Halloween, obviously, Scream and things like that. So Friday the 13th was one of many sort of moments in my life where I rediscovered my intense love of horror films and horror novels and things like that. So I wrote the oral history of that game for Fangoria magazine in like what,
Nice.
2018, 19, I don't know what time is anymore, but I reviewed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre game for RogerEbert.com, and I'm really excited to play the Killer Clowns game. I don't know what I can say there because embargoes are weird, but I'm looking forward to playing that with people and seeing how that goes.
What is your opinion about Dead by Daylight, the other online multiplayer horror game?
I played it and it's very fun and well made. It's a little bit kind of too intense and pressure cookery for me. Maybe I haven't given it enough of a chance because I was playing so much Friday at the time, but obviously they've included a lot of licensed content that I really like in that game, like the Hellraiser and Halloween and I think even Alien. So, I mean, there were a lot of like reasons that I should play more Dead by Daylight, but my impression of it when I spent a lot of time with it was kind of that I had more fun with Friday because it was less kind of stressful.
Right.
That's another weird quirk of my gaming habits in life, is like between like whatever crap I've got going on in my life, whether it's, work stress or, mental health stuff or what have you. It's like, I don't necessarily want to play Elden Ring at 5:00 when I get off work. I want to play something a little more chill, something more like Stardew Valley or, what have you, something kind of chill. And so I think Friday the 13th was the first horror game that I played that it was like, oh, I'm not like having a heart attack the whole time. I'm actually enjoying myself. And, there's a lot of like laughter and just joy in it. It's not just like jump scares.
Right.
No offense to those other games.
Oh, no, totally not. But you briefly abbreviated the game as just Friday for a second there. And I thought about, what if there was a Night in the Woods game, a Friday game, like the Ice Cube movie, but like in the style of Night in the Woods? And that was like a very pleasant thought I had for 3 seconds before I continued listening to your, connection to the game.
Well, let's pitch that and we can co-develop it or something.
There we go.
But yeah, I mean, Friday the 13th is just, I still play it, 7 years later. And I think it's going to be shut down in December, potentially, is what they're hinting at. So I'm kind of in like this mourning period, this premature mourning of hopefully like this friend group that I've played with for 7 years is going to maybe migrate over to Killer Clowns, and maybe they won't, I don't know. So it's kind of just this interesting little, nice little hobby that I've had for 7 years. And the game is still fun, and it's very simple, and it hasn't really changed all that much the way a lot of live service games have because of the ongoing litigation between various parties that have been suing each other over the rights to Friday the 13th for like a decade or more. So
Yeah. It's very not rare, I guess, but like it is certainly a blessing when an online experience can last as long as Friday the 13th has, because there have been other online games, some in the horror, genre multiplayer game that haven't even lasted that long, such as the Evil Dead co-op game that came out a couple years ago didn't last very long in the online space, which is unfortunate. But I hope that there's a way for these things to continue to survive, because this seems to be a game that still means a lot to a number of people.
Yeah, I hope that the modding communities can kind of keep the best of them alive. I think that that'll probably happen with Friday and Evil Dead, but I don't know how accessible and user-friendly that'll be. I mean, I guess we'll find out soon, but
Ice Cube, I have a pitch for you.
Yeah.
Let's get those servers back up with a very special trick. Yeah. Before I move into today's game really quickly, what have you been playing lately?
I play a lot of Modern Warfare 3. I've been playing a lot of Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 4. A little bit of Halo, a little bit of Dragon Quest 11.
All right.
A lot of
Lifetime
random
games.
Yeah, just a lot of like random stuff. But I play a lot of shooters, a lot of Star Wars, a lot of Halo, and various odds and ends, like various indies. I'll play for an hour or two here and there, but too much Call of Duty.
Too much Call of Duty. I envy your ability to juggle more than one video game at a time. I just have started production on the podcast for the first time in about 6 weeks because of so many traveling things I had to take care of in the same window of time. And the only video game I've been able to sit down and play during that time has been the game I've been plucking away at for over a month now, which is the Final Fantasy VII Rebirth game. And that it's having a wonderful time with that. That's the kind of game where I can imagine like it's, I can play this and replay this a lot just because it's kind of my platonic ideal of what an open world formula kind of game is. And it has enough different little things that it throws in there to break things up a bit. But literally, as soon as I'm like, all right, let's schedule some recordings again. Let's go back. Let's be on the grind and talk about video games. Boom, Hades 2 is out. Boom, Animal Well. Boom, Crow County. It's just like everything is suddenly releasing at once. And I want to talk about and play all of them. But here I am talking about games instead. So I envy your ability to jump around between things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's stop talking about a bunch of games and just talk about one game. The game that, you have a lot of affection for: Halo 2, Friday the 13th, the game, Destiny, all these games that you've spent time talking about. But when presented the option, you settled on today's game, Night in the Woods. Night in the Woods is a 2D story-focused exploration game developed by Infinite Fall and published by Finji. Finji was also the publisher for critically acclaimed titles such as Chicory, A Colorful Tale, Tunic, and I Was a Teenage Exocolonist. In Night in the Woods, you play as May Borowski, a 20-year-old who drops out of college and returns to her hometown of Possum Springs, a former mining town populated by zoomorphic people that has been in steep decline following the closure of the coal mines. May, a black cat, is trying to resume the life she had before she went away to college, but the places and people that live in Possum Springs have changed, including her old friend group, Greg, a crime-loving, hyperactive fox, his boyfriend Angus, a soft-spoken bear, and Bee, a gloomy crocodile. One friend of May's, Casey, went missing while she was away at college. As May, you spend your days exploring the town of Possum Springs, walking and jumping around power lines and rooftops, causing mischief, catching up with the residents, and trying to reconnect with the people who've grown apart from you. May's nights are spent having strange, vivid dreams. At the town's Harvest Festival, or Harfest, May sees a teenager get kidnapped by some mysterious figure. Believing a ghost may be responsible for the recent kidnappings in Possum Springs, May becomes determined to investigate and ropes in her old friends to help her. Shenanigans ensue. Let's talk about the game's story in greater detail in a bit, but I do want to go over some background details about the game. Night in the Woods was funded via a Kickstarter campaign that launched in October of 2013. Its $50,000 funding goal was reached in 26 hours, and the campaign went on to earn $209,375 from 7,372 backers. Night in the Woods was co-written by married couple Bethany Hockenberry and Scott Benson. This was the couple's first time developing a video game. Scott Benson was also the game's artist and animator. Influences on the game's art include comic book artist Chris Ware and Mike Mignola, Walt Disney Company artist Mary Blair, as well as children's author and illustrator Richard Scarry. Southern Gothic writer Flannery O'Connor was also cited as an influence, as well as the video games Dark Souls and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. More on that point later, because it sounds out there, but I read his reasoning for it, and we'll get back to that. Alec Kaloka was the game's composer and programmer. Charles Hetner provided additional animations. Adam Saltzman, developer of the game Canabalt, as well as the founder of the game's publisher Benji, designed the game within the game Demon Tower, a roguelike that May can play on her computer. Night in the Woods was originally released on February 21st, 2017. Other games released in 2017 include Everything, both literally and figuratively. A lot of great fucking games came out in 2017, and one of them was literally titled Everything. But Cuphead, also released in 2017, Destiny 2, Divinity, Original Sin 2, which was developed by Larian, who would go on to develop Baldur's Gate 3, Hollow Knight, Nier Automata, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, aka PUBG, Prey, Pyre, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, Super Mario Odyssey, What Remains of Edith Finch, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which I previously covered on the show with Emily from My Brother, My Captain, My Podcast. Hell of a year for games. Possibly, like some people would argue, it's one of the best, video game years ever. And I mean, this game is a part of that legacy.
Yeah, so Night in the Woods, I reviewed for Glixel the week that my son was born. I had reviewed Halo Wars 2, another great 2017 game that went up, I think the same day my son was born, or maybe the day after. And it was kind of this huge, high, peak moment in my life where I was like, man, everything is really, really great right now. There's no way that site is going to let me write for them again. It's all downhill from here. So in my sort of fear and panic, I immediately pitched them on, hey, what if I wrote about Night in the Woods, which I had sort of written a sort of E3 reaction piece for Kill Screen a year or two earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I had just sort of seen Anthony Carboni at E3, showing it off or whatever, and seeing some gameplay. And, it looked very funny and cute and the kind of thing that, I'm a big fan of SpongeBob SquarePants and BoJack Horseman and things like that. And, in comic books like The Goon. Yeah, the millennial staples. And so, it caught my eye as a sort of it looks like a comic book, and it had platforming, and it looked sort of chill and a kind of game that I could play with a newborn baby in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And, to my surprise, Glixel said, sure, yeah, love to have you review it. And it totally just, I was feeling a lot of emotions at the time. I was sort of very receptive to a game like that is doing some really ambitious things and really wants to communicate a lot of big ideas to sort of, young wayward souls. I was 20 something, I don't know what, but yeah. So I was very much open to that game at that moment, and saw myself in it, probably to an extent that I had never seen myself in a video game before, because they don't really make games about working class losers in garage bands or whatever from small towns and things like that, right? So
yeah, they don't make 90s movies as video games, no.
Yeah, it's it was just such a it was charming. The characters were all very memorable, and the dialogue was funny, and it was sort of had a rage to it, it had that sort of working class rage bubbling under the surface, which wow, did I love that. And I it never gets old. And I think that the character of May is great, and I will never get tired of her. But I even more B. Santello, her friend, her sort of childhood best friend that she's sort of grown apart from, is probably my favorite character in the game. I went to college for 5 years, and like I don't know why I did that. I sort of recognized myself from a few years earlier in the game, right? That sort of like the kid who wanted to be like an artist or a writer, an author, what have you, but like was sort of playing in a garage band and just sort of angry at the world, and a little bit sort of aimless and lost, that kind of thing. So it has a lot of that. It has politics. It has like talk of unions and like all these sort of like leftist working class ideas. It has that sort of Bruce Springsteen quality to it. It also is situated in this sort of weird fiction kind of realm of like Twin Peaks, which I also adore. And it has that mystery to it, that sort of cult and the murder and, and disappearances and all that stuff. And so it really hit every one of my buttons. Like I said, at a time when I was very kind of emotionally receptive and vulnerable to trying to write about a game in a critical, analytical way for like this big publication, at the time, it's just one of those games that changes your life if you play it at the right moment. I told my friend he had to play it, and he speed ran through it in 3 hours, and was like, that was cool, and you can play it that way, but like to the right audience, right? Night in the Woods is quite a game.
Yeah, it's a game you got to chew, not just swallow.
Exactly.
This is a very personal game. Personal in the sense that only a handful of people worked on it, but also personal in the stakes of it. Like you said, it has a lot to say thematically. It has a lot of emotional truth to it. This comes from a very specific place, from very specific backgrounds vis-a-vis the writer's experience coming up in Western Pennsylvania. This is a very Rust Belt feeling town, and like it does evoke, small town Americana, Southern Gothic stories, the supernatural. Western Pennsylvania in real life is probably full of cryptids. It's a very strange place, but I'm glad that you picked this game because it's a very unique game and in a lot of ways feels very singular. But before we can talk about that, we do have to cover another topic that we do every episode, video game preservation, in a segment I do in every episode called No Country for Old Games. Now, before we talk about Night in the Woods in greater detail, and we can talk about our personal, specific connection to this game, we have to talk about how readily available this game is to those who are interested in playing it, so people can check it out. And the subject of video game preservation means a great deal to me because I believe that video games are an art form, and this game is certainly indicative of that. I believe that they create experiences that leave some kind of impact on the people who play them. The interactive space is very unique in that regard. Unfortunately, this means very little to publishers who have historically struggled with keeping older games available on modern hardware. And as time goes on, games that were once easily readily available to purchase and play become more and more difficult to acquire. I mean, this is so much in the digital space and the physical space in general. I mean, you collect movies, you're a writer, and, websites become defunct or acquired. We'll get to that. But in this segment, we will rate today's game on a scale of A to ARG. And ARG is obviously an expression of frustration and how hard it is to acquire a game, and not me covertly advocating for piracy, which is illegal. That's a crime. I'm not Greg, but Greg loves crime. Anyway, Night in the Woods was originally released on Windows, Mac, Linux, and PlayStation 4 on February 21st, 2017. The game would go on to be released on Xbox One on December 13th, 2017, the Nintendo Switch, February 1st, 2018. Indie developer Secret Lab, who created the narrative engine, developed a mobile version of Night in the Woods, which released on iOS on September 9th, 2021.
On December 13th, 2017, the same day of the Xbox One release, an update called Weird Autumn was released. This update included changes and new content, including access to supplemental games Longest Night and Lost Consolation in the Extras menu, the ability to replay band minigames by playing the bass in Maze Room, as well as new songs you can play on bass, new NPCs in the town, additional interactions, dialogue, hangouts, and more. All versions of the game purchased after this update are automatically the Weird Autumn Edition. Limited Run Games, a video game distributor that sells limited quantities of physical versions of primarily digital games, distributed a physical collector's edition. The collector's edition included the game as well as CDs of the soundtracks for both it and the game within the game, Demon Tower. Acrylic stands, a coin, a physical version of May's Journal, a planisphere, glow-in-the-dark cards, and stickers were also included. This special collector's edition was available for pre-order between December 18th, 2022 and January 29th, 2023, and is no longer available for purchase on the Limited Run website. This episode's already kind of long, so I'll save you my feelings on Limited Run's business model and forced scarcity, but it's nice that this game got a physical release in any form, and there's still room in the future for it to get a physical release under a different distributor. But when it comes to indie games, I don't typically rate the physical availability of the thing, just whether or not it is more or less available than it originally was. So, if anything, this game has only become more available as time goes on, which is great. Alex, when you play this game, how do you play it?
So I'm kind of a monster when it comes to Night in the Woods in that I own this on every platform except smartphone. So I played it on PS4, which has now been, upgraded for free to the PS5 version. I have it on my Switch. I have it on Xbox. I have it on Steam. I have it on itch. I have it on pretty much all the platforms except for smartphone. So yeah, but I tend to play stuff on Steam now. I got a nice computer for the first time ever in like October. So yeah, I've been kind of playing everything on that now, but I played it for the first time on PS4 and that was a good platform for it. I love that DualShock 4 controller, and Night in the Woods is a game that, you're going to get the same, perfect parity across platforms. You're going to get the same experience pretty much anywhere. It's not a very demanding game. It's built in Unity. It's, pretty 2D. So
yeah,
that makes it kind of easy to keep going, I think, compared to, Fallout New Vegas or, or something that's like only on the Ubisoft launcher or what have you. Right. So.
Yeah, no, it's a very stable and not demanding game to play, which has lent itself to being able to be played on your fucking phone, which is incredible. I mean, you have so many versions of this game. You obviously keep that thing on you. Do you own the physical version of the game?
Yeah, so I've bought from Limited Run Games. I bought 2 collector's editions over the years. One it being Shadows of the Empire because it had some sick 90s Star Wars art on it, and it had an N64 cartridge. And then Night in the Woods collector's edition because it is kind of the game. If I could only keep one game and all the others disappear, probably going to keep Night in the Woods. I had to get the physical one. Yeah.
Yeah. And physical releases for independently released games are such a rarity. Yet I got to jump on that as often as possible personally.
Mm-hmm.
All that being said, I would say this game is the rare A for available. With this kind of like project, you have to sort of like look at things in terms of how they were originally released and where they are now. And this game has become more available, which is great. A game from like such a humble background, expanding itself and finding a reach on multiple different consoles. It's also, inspiring. And this is a game that's trying to be seen and experienced by as many people as possible. And you'd hope that other publishers with more means to do so would do the same. But I'm glad that Night in the Woods is abundantly available because it's a wonderful game, and we're not the only people who feel that way. The PC version of this game holds an 88 out of 100 on the review aggregation website Metacritic in the year of its release, which was such a busy year. It was nominated for multiple awards across different outlets, but we're not here to reduce the legacy of Night in the Woods to a series of numbers, accolades. We're here to talk about the impact the game had on the people who played that. So, without further preamble, let's get into that, Alex.
Do you miss getting kicked in the face at Warped Tour?
Did you shatter your glasses in a mosh pit in 2007?
Did you wear more studded belts than a Final Fantasy character?
Then we have the show for you.
We are So Emo I Fell Apart, a podcast about third wave emo, late night live journal updates, burnt hair, and everything in between.
Join us every second Saturday as we examine major moments in the history of emo and keep you updated on current events.
Because it was never a phase.
What is it that you love about Night in the Woods? And what does it do that you wish more video games would do?
Well, it cares about everyday people that you know from your life, right? So I think of a game like, I don't want to pick on anybody, but like Cyberpunk, or even like the NPCs in like Red Dead Redemption 2, or like all these giant open world games that are like populous and just filled with people that you can interact with in a lot of cases, or sometimes not. But like Night in the Woods, first of all, for a game that's made by like a handful of people, every character that you can interact with has such life and such character, and a distinctive, memorable name, a distinctive, memorable design, the sort of like hand-drawn cartoon look that you can instantly recognize which character is which. One of the best examples of what makes the game great is there's this character named Selmers, who she sort of like hangs out on her stoop, like sketching and journaling and like writing like poetry in her little diary. And she talks about how her partner ran off, and maybe her therapist told her to keep a journal or something like that, which is something you do in the game as well. It's a character that I think you could just ignore and walk past if you wanted to. But instead you have these great, potentially daily conversations with her. And then at one of the sort of climactic character moments in the game, you sort of you see her put on like a slam poem like performance, where she performs one of her poems in the old train station underground, I think, or somewhere like that, or the library or something. And it's this really beautifully written, like rage-filled kind of poem about like life in the 21st century for a working class person in a small town. And as somebody who grew up in a little Rust Belt town with 7,000 people or whatever, and not a lot of job opportunities, man, all that shit is so meaningful to me. Obama used to give speeches, and he would use the city that I live in now, he would use it as like a stand-in for like sort of dead cities with no opportunities. Like he would name check the city where I live as kind of like a place that is struggling. And it is like, I go to the movie theater and there's nobody there, man. Like, and you ask people where they work, and I mean, it's like, there's just everybody's doing the same, handful of jobs and things like that. So
right, like the towns that feel like the Last Picture Show sort of stuff.
Yes, and I adore the movie The Last Picture Show. I love that movie. That was a movie I saw when I was like a teenager that, again, kind of that Night in the Woods moment of like, oh, it's like a small, sad town, like the one that I know and love. And I think there's something really powerful to be said for artists kind of, in their work, like writing these sort of love letters to these places that maybe if you're someone who grew up in a city and, always had money and never had to worry about how you're going to pay the rent, like, something like Last Picture Show might sail over your head. I don't know. But I think these little towns are really beautiful. And when May says stuff about like, oh, I used to listen to the train, howling at night when I was laying in my bed and things like that. I thought of, that's early in the game, and I thought immediately of how, my childhood bedroom was like right outside the train tracks, essentially a couple blocks away from the train tracks and things like that. So the things that Scott Benson cares about and tweets about, really resonate with me as somebody who's into sort of weird fiction and cartoons and is angry about politics all the time, and angry about work culture all the time, things like that. So not a lot of games are in that sort of realm, right? They're abstract, and they're looking at other things, they're looking at guns and the theater of war, or else like really surreal, abstract, Sonic and Mega Man. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. May's not Sonic.
Yeah, exactly. So Night in the Woods, even though they're animals, I mean, if they weren't animals, you'd be like, oh, I know that person in real life. I know exactly who that is, you know?
No, I mean, this is a very real game underneath the veneer of cute animals in a gothic setting. It comes from a place of like you said, like there's righteous anger, but there's hurt underneath that. There's a lot of prickliness to this game. Characters that are not, people like to say unlikable. It's not unlikable. They're characters that are fuck ups, people who make mistakes, people who have aren't saintly and not idealized. They are frank depictions of real people dealing with real circumstances. And this game really does not give you that freedom to see these characters as anything other than fundamentally flawed, hurt, angry, righteously so in some cases bitter in others. And it's a game that's constantly presenting the emotional states of people and how they cope. It is a game of cope, which is very interesting because video games as a medium is very much about fantasy in the commercial sense, and this is a game that's not really a power fantasy like so much as coping. And it's very interesting to see a game sort of be the opposite of our mainstream understanding of a video game. I think video games now are like the most like generate the more revenue than any other medium in this moment in time. And they're like these big like demands for, in these studios for like big blockbuster games that just are big money suckers made by like thousands of people. And then here is this game made by, written just by two people, has a very clear voice and visual sense behind it, and is like just telling a very specific personal story. Like you feel the authorial voices behind it and like the artistry of it. And it's just so moving to see that. Like the game itself is like this experience, but just like the conditions under which it was made lend itself and give a lot of legitimacy to that.
Yeah, and if you play the sort of two bonus supplemental games like Longest Night and Lost Constellation,
Yeah.
those sort of enrich it too with like this sort of made up folklore and stuff, like this kind of mythology a little bit that kind of with all the sort of astral projection or whatever and all the like weird constellation lore. I think all that stuff is completely made up from the imagination, but it comes from the same, universal archetypes and like the collective unconscious or wherever these things come from, right? So I think it was Longest Night, the one that really I was like, oh, I'm so glad I took the time to play this and not just skip it because it's not actually part of the main game, because it really does feel like this sort of prologue or epilogue where you get to see a little bit more about how that imagination works.
For sure. When this game was in development, these were sort of things presented to backers of the game as material that would tide people over in anticipation for the release, generate hype for the release. It served that specific purpose, but with the whole piece now available and these supplementary things included in expanded versions of the game, it does also have this additive effect that is seamlessly of a piece with the game, where there's so much missable stuff in this game that you have to choose to want to engage with a lot of it, which is very interesting. And part of what I was talking about earlier with Scott Benson talking about how Symphony of the Night and Dark Souls were an influence on this game. You have to choose to want to experience this stuff, and there is rewarded information from that, which is like developing closeness with the townspeople and becoming invested in their emotional journeys, or learning more about Possum Springs as like this entity. And this interview that he gave for ZAM, the way that he talked about how Symphony of the Night and Dark Souls were like these influences. He said, yeah, Dark Souls was a big influence in the sense of having content that you can miss easily. Like people will be in certain places some days and in other places in other days, and you have to go around and catch it, and you can miss things. And he talks about how Lost Constellation, that was a big aspect of that. There's a back corner of that game that a lot of people completely missed, where you can go see the forest god and you can go find out what happened to an earlier character. And there's something super gratifying about that. There's something great about a world that does not need you to move all of its levers. And then he goes on to talk about Symphony of the Night, where he says, that's the most generous game I've ever played. It's a game that just gives and gives. There are so many ideas, so many throwaway things that are antithetical to the kind of hyper-disciplined, minimalist, everything in its place design that's hip right now. He contrasts it with like Jonathan Blow game design, like Braid, The Witness, and things like that. He doesn't want things to be like a nothing out of place Apple product version of a video game. He says like Symphony of the Night is this big shaggy thing. You can get boots, and a description of the boots is it makes you taller, and then your character is 1 pixel taller. And that's like a very interesting game design philosophy to bring into this small, shaggy indie game where it's like, I put this in there because I wanted to put this thing in there, and it's a choice, and you are rewarded for finding it. Not necessarily in like a stats and level up kind of way, but just like you get entertainment out of it, or like you just feel something besides power.
He has a list of rules for game design or lessons that he learned making Night in the Woods, and I like copied those into a Google Doc when I was working on a Twine project. And I think he says something to the effect of, I don't use branching dialogue as a means of role playing, but rather as a means of exploration. And I feel like that sums up Night in the Woods pretty well.
Yeah.
It's a game where you kind of read it from left to right or cover to cover, and the story isn't going to radically change, but you're going to see and experience like very different things than somebody else might, in the sense of like different people are going to be curious about different areas or different storylines or characters, or are you going to spend a particular evening with Greg or with B, or who's going to be your favorite and things like that. And so yeah, I don't know if I've ever really played it the same way twice, and yet I feel there's still like tons of stuff that I haven't seen. I've probably beaten it 4 or 5 times, and I'm always sort of got a playthrough going and just kind of exploring. And yeah, I'm like I feel that it's rich, and I'm in no particular hurry to see everything, because that would be I'd be kind of sad if I just sort of did a completionist run where I tried to see everything at min-max such a narrative game. But yeah, it's beautifully designed.
No, I agree. And it's very interesting, right? Because you talk about that like 100%, I want to see everything and have like this completionist mentality. And that's very common, and I'm guilty of it in certain spaces and contexts, but I don't want that to be the only way to experience a video game. And I think if we want to look at video games as an art form, we have to be open to the idea of not being able to have it all in a game. And that, idea of not being able to have it all is certainly thematically consistent with the game's themes, even if it's not necessarily even if it's in a different way than like how the game is talking about that kind of stuff. Just like the idea that in one particular run, you can't go on all the friendship hangs that are an option to you, because this is going to overlap with this thing this other person's doing, and you have to choose one or the other, which is true to life in a lot of ways. Like 2 interesting things happening at the same time and have to make a choice. Wow. But you see the way that this could be another kind of gameplay style. Like this is like a 2D side-scrolling video game, but you can see how this could have been a point-and-click game or a visual novel, even with the same kind of like design philosophy of you can't have it all. But it chooses to be this 2D, vaguely platforming thing instead. And yeah. I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, the platforming feels shockingly good, considering it didn't necessarily have to be that way, but it suits the fact that your character is a cat, and you sort of walk on all these like power lines and things that a cat could theoretically jump up on, right? Like a rooftop and things like that. So it just feels very playful and kind of, it's very bouncy and kind of soft geometry kind of game. It feels incredible to explore the city. It's not like left and right. It's, there's verticality, and there's an underground, and there are buildings you can go inside.
Yeah. Instead of being like a traditional adventure game, making it into a platformer sort of makes you closer to May as a character, because that playfulness certainly ties into the way that she presents this lackadaisical, happy-go-lucky attitude about things, this lack of reverence for, social norms, people getting mad at her that she's walking across the power lines and jumping on top of rooftops, and like there are like consistent characters like, stop fucking doing that, but you continuing to do it anyway because it's the more fun way of getting around as a character, and that's just way more interesting than if you were just doing a more traditional adventure game. This game isn't, purely original. I wouldn't say this game's avant-garde in any way, but I do think it's uniquely singular in how it chooses to approach this kind of narrative-driven storyline by using not narrative-driven storyline mechanics like a side-scrolling game. And we'll talk about the actual story beats and like the themes of everything shortly, but like it does tie into the idea of like May is a unique person with like specific quirks that make May. But that doesn't mean May is like has wholly unique experiences. She's identifiable. There's relatable things that you see in other people through May. And I think that's what makes this game interesting, is how it's unique, but like it's not wholly original. It stands out in a certain way, but it isn't entirely its own thing. Does that track? Does that scan?
Yeah, it's like it's a pretty unique like vision and like combination of things, but it's very easy to watch Twin Peaks or Blue Velvet or Scott Pilgrim, even like the Scott Pilgrim comics or something, and like see little bits and pieces of things you recognize. And I think Benson wasn't familiar with Twin Peaks, he says, obviously, oddly enough, but it has that kind of feel of like the small town where weird stuff's going on. And I guess that's kind of a universal sort of American thing, that sort of
Americana. Yeah,
Springsteen like has that darkness on the edge of town, right? Like that kind of, every small town has its sort of like lore, and Richard Speck, like a mass murderer, he's a character in the show Mindhunter. He was in my hometown for a number of years and lived there, and so that's part of the little town's lore. And it's like there's so many beautiful things that I love about my hometown, but then I watch a movie like Halloween, which takes place in a very fictionalized version of the county where I grew up, and it's like, oh, there is that kind of weird dark lore to small towns, like Richard Speck. It's very weird.
Yeah, there's so much media about like the the evil of suburban and small town living, but like they're approaching it from different angles, and especially the Rust Belt, where it's like a different kind of abandonment that's been brought about by let's get into it. This is a game about community, fundamentally, and deindustrialization. And you're familiar with this as someone who grew up in a small town, so I don't really have to explain this to you, but for our listeners, the process by which industry has abandoned the people because the people began to feel like they deserve better, or because of what they'll present it in the form of like redundancies, that things are moving away from this, but like the fundamental truth of it is like it went away because they didn't want to play fair anymore. Something happens, the people who have the means to fix it decide, no, we would just rather go take this exploitation somewhere else where you can't see it. And then let me put it this way, it is the process through which people are like told, my community is entitled to a sense of dignity. Let me just put that indignity somewhere else where nobody else can see it, and I can continue to exploit people. And then the people in this community will just suffer for it and feel bitter, and it will destroy itself.
Yeah, and it's like a cyclical thing. I mean, you see that in the game where they talk about labor issues, and they talk about, the Postabilities went out of business, our favorite little Italian joint. And, that's another way you kind of see yourself in games, is like in a game like Night in the Woods, is stuff comes and goes, and it's her dad's working at the Ham Panther now, I think is what it's called, and it's like the Walmart killing off all the small businesses. That's a very universal thing for a lot of us as well.
Yeah,
it very much is that small town community thing that's kind of universal and very American, from Stephen King to Stranger Things. I mean, it always comes back in style, but Night in the Woods does it in a particular way, with a particular voice.
Yeah, but it does it in like a frank way where it doesn't feel like this is somebody making an observation about American life so much as somebody who's lived an American life and has friends and family and has personal experiences, and they're expressing that into this tapestry of this video game that we're experiencing that makes it so much more raw and real than a lot of the pop depictions of this stuff. Like, I am deeply uncomfortable with a lot of pop depictions of poverty. It's the reason why I've never been able to connect with Shameless specifically. It's just because it feels like lurid, leery, kind of like, oh, isn't this entertaining? And like the fucked up nature of the reality that makes people into fucked up people. But I do think, whereas that feels removed from it, this feels very much in the paint with it, and that's what makes this so spectacular at the way it's able to present the characters and the stakes, even if they don't feel like, oh, world-ending stakes. They are certainly ones that you're able to understand and empathize and learn from without it feeling didactic.
Yeah, like May comes home and she's always thought of her parents as like having a decent living and not having to worry about money so much. She sort of comes home and she's worried about, she notices that her mom is worried about paying the mortgage or, maybe losing the family home and things like that. And yeah, like people are going to recognize themselves in that if they come from that sort of, working class upbringing. And yeah, it feels authentic. I think that, even Stephen King is like filthy rich these days, but I think that his books resonate with people because he remembers what it's like to grow up sort of poor and floating from home to home with his single mom and things like that. And I think it's really hard to fake like an economic worldview, right? Like to, not to pick on like Stranger Things again, but like, okay, they live in like a trailer or whatever at a trailer park. And like, yeah, like I had, a grandfather who lived in a trailer park and like it had like its own unique quirks and things like that. But poverty is something that can look like so many different things in so many different places. And in Night in the Woods, it's kind of that very typical sort of lower middle class thing of things are fine today. They could go really wrong tomorrow when dad doesn't get his paycheck or whatever, or whatever. And, when I was freelance for 7 years, if somebody decided to just stop paying me, things could go really awry really quickly, just because you try to plan ahead. But if somebody's not paying you all of a sudden, it can go, upside down in a hurry. And so I think that's what May's mother is worried about with their jobs that they're working. I think she works at like the church, and then the dad works at the Ham Panther in like the meat department or something.
Yeah. They're like recognizable things without being too archetypical, which I think is like, part of the secret sauce of what makes this game work. There's the specificities that make things great, like the implied conditions of a lot of people beyond May and her family. Like, B had to give up on her dreams to take care of her father, and that's created like contributes to the gulf between her experiences and May's, where May is like, presenting herself as this, woe is me, I've suffered, I've fallen from the tower initially. Obviously, I'm not saying that is her totality of the experience. I love May as a character and how like that character goes all over the place. B is very much, her downbeat nature is informed by the fact that she has resigned herself to a place because she has this sense of obligation to care for her family and to compromise herself in order to pursue that. And when she looks at May, who's presenting herself in this one way, she's seeing this person who's like able to be selfish to an extent and is bitter about the fact that it didn't work out. Obviously, that's not the case. Obviously, like May dropped out of college for reasons pertaining to her mental health. It's not ever explicitly said like what the exact incident was, I don't think, but it's clear that she's very much has a troubled life that she has been working on. And that's a big thing this game is showing to you, is to how we don't see everybody in one moment, but when they reveal themselves to you, there's this outburst of empathy that you can't help but have as you begin to understand a person more.
Yeah, there's a really great recognizable moment early in the game, I think, where the group is sort of hanging out at the pizza joint, I think, right after like band practice. And May is like, so what are you all up to tomorrow? And B just goes, we have jobs, May, or something like that. And it's like so great because, we're all so like online and on Twitter and things like that these days. And we see this very, this sort of pseudo realities that Philip K. Dick warned us about, like, everybody's just kind of hanging out on the beach and, soaking up the sun, and there's, no worries. Everything is so great for everybody. And
let's go to the beach. Let's go swimming. Let's go golfing. Tell them to bring the yacht out.
We're all going to be okay as like, see current world events play out, right? But just that sense of we have jobs, May, like we don't get to just dick around the way that May does, sort of in the scope of the story, right? It's like people have to get up at 9 and go to work, or they don't pay the rent or feed their children, or so it's that kind of frustration of like that sort of day-to-day 9 to 5 reality that a lot of storytelling just kind of hand waves away or glosses over.
Yeah. In Night in the Woods, you play as your unemployed friend on a Tuesday.
Basically.
Yeah.
Out here in Amish, smoking big doinks in Amish. It's fucking nice out. Who's trying to chill, smoke some loud, feel me? I got loud.
That is true, the hand waving of like, do you guys have jobs of watching a movie where it's like, is this all happening on afternoons and weekends? What is happening? Yeah, no, I mean, like that golf is like basically like your power fantasy is like being able to like explore the town on the free time that May has as she's trying to find herself as she's adjusting back to Possum Springs. And, this gives her a certain amount of access into seeing how people's day-to-day lives operate, but it's also but it's also not idealizing that because she's also the kind of person that has to get up in the afternoon, and a lot of your interactions are with people who are very clearly irritated with you because you are kind of in the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's those specific things like the specific hangs that you have with people, the things that they reveal to you on one-on-one conversations come back to that. But there's the broader story about like the kidnappings and May investigating that and how that's tying into her own emotional mental health as she gets more and more visions that are very much like revealing themselves to be astral projections of a kind, very, again, surreal themes. That it ultimately is revealed that like this deep evil that's permeating the town is being caused by like it's not a mystical supernatural entity that is causing the problems so much as the deification of that by like the most powerful remaining people in the town.
Yeah, it's kind of open to interpretation a little bit because like May is this very selfish, materialistic worldview, right? Where she's kind of like, the world is me and my problems. And I don't think she's particularly religious, but maybe, she kind of, her mother works in a church, and there's like all this sort of iconography. There's a character in the game that I think might be God, the custodian with like the drill fixing the door and stuff. He seems like he might be kind of like a god figure, and there's just all these like weird little touches like that kind of hint at in fantasy storytelling or like the hero's journey. Someone like May, who is selfish and disconnected, not entirely of her own fault, but obviously she's got things that she has to work through as well, as we all do. We all have our sort of darkness and baggage and shadows. She needs to be kind of connected to that community, and that's part of that in a mythological story or a weird story like Night in the Woods or what have you, Star Wars, Twin Peaks, whatever, is like you do have to get in touch with that spiritual part of yourself that an angry 20-year-old atheist or whatever is kind of like, I don't have any time for that bullshit. But at some point in your life, you do start to connect with that stuff and think, what is the spiritual component in life, and, does it matter, and what does it mean for me? And, how do I kind of recognize that I'm not separate from these other people, right? May and B are both part of the fabric of this community, as you kind of said.
Yeah, I mean, like, it's a game about community, right? And spirituality is possibly like the most common vector through which community emerges, vis-a-vis organized religion, right?
Mhm.
I relate to the aspect of, like, I have a mother who is devoutly Christian, and it is very hard to have conversations about certain subjects because I have a more secular view about, like, the reality of the situation, whereas she chooses to see a lot of the conflict of the world as symptomatic of a spiritual war between God and the devil. And it's like, that's a great metaphor for looking at it, but ultimately, the devil and God are people. God is a community, and the devil is also a community, which is to say, when May goes into a coma because of, like, the stress of her mental health, she does get saved by people who are, like, in, like, the local church. But the ultimate villains of the game, like the antagonists who are kidnapping people, are also in a cult. And their reasoning for doing these awful things is because we believe that if we sacrifice people to this god, this ancient being, we believe that that will bring prosperity back to the town. We think that by perpetuating evil, perhaps we can stand to gain from it. They've organized and formed, evil community to inflict pain on other people, when prosperity comes by organizing with your fellow man to, lift one another up, not to knock other people down.
Yeah. I think that you could say there's a spiritual sickness in our world and in the world of Night in the Woods, and in many, stories. That's kind of how things start, is like things are off, and I think that sort of what they do. I mean, I don't know if it's like the best handled part of the story necessarily, but you have these working class, everyman type characters who are in this cult in Night in the Woods that are sort of disappearing people and feeding them to this abyss or whatever. In history, they would have been like the coal miners or whatever, who had this like tragic. I think there was like some kind of massacre in the history of Possum Springs, and so it's like, they were like the victims of like the labor struggle once upon a time, and instead of like maintaining the sort of like healthy, like, let's unionize, let's like find a way to build a better town, they took this like human sacrifice route instead.
Right? They fell into despair.
It's a really good metaphor for how darkness and, frankly, like fascism thrives in the real world, right? Like, it always comes about when people are looking for a scapegoat. They're looking for something to blame for systemic power structures and economic downturn and things. So it's like, okay, we're going to start blaming it on the whatever, the woke mind virus or whatever, or the trans community or whatever, like the boogeyman is, right? That they're going to like blame all these problems on, right? And I think it's a really scary time to be alive in the world at the moment. Fascism is like sort of out in the open in this way that, even like post 9/11, I don't know if it was this bad, right? It's become like normalized, and it's a spooky time. I think that the cult and Night in the Woods is a great kind of allegory for that.
Right, yeah. I mean, like, they even say, like, the people that we are choosing to sacrifice are people that they won't miss, or that they perceive people won't be missed. But one of the first revealed kidnappings is a very close friend of May's and her friend group who used to be in the band, and B had to replace that person in the band. And there's a very clear hole left in, like, that whole, like, generational friend group. Casey was one of the sacrifices. Like, the teenager that May sees kidnapped at Harfest, that was a person, just because, and like, May would have been a part of that because they just perceive the people who are in the way as simply that. They're only seeing, well, I mean, obviously that's, only seeing one facet of people would never be a reason to. A lot of people are literally just vibing and living their lives and not hurting people, but people have bought into the fascistic idea that the problems are a people and not some force that is actively trying to keep people down. Like in this case, this is a very clear critique of capitalism as an entity, the way that it thrives on individualizing and atomizing people, where we are so hyper individualist and yet we cannot see the individuals around us.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way that certain people of a certain ideology are able to organize is as a mob to put the weaker people down, because to deal with the strong person, the person who is, has the boot on your neck, is so scary. And I do think that game represents that struggle really well. I know some people have some critiques about how that ending has played out, but I do think as I've sat with it over the years, it has only aged well and has only proved itself time and time again as time has passed.
Yeah, it kind of leaves things a little bit subtextual and lets you kind of it leaves it open to sort of various meanings. But yeah, it's kind of like this group of people banded together. They sort of unionized and they did it for evil and for nefarious things. And instead of conquering the spiritual sickness in the world, they fed it. And I don't know. I don't think that I fully got what was going on the first time I played it. I just knew that it resonated and I knew the stuff that I really loved. But each playthrough, I see more and more of, the leftism and the labor stuff. And I think it's beautifully done, but it's, I think that if anything, it could be a little bit more explicit occasionally. I like that it's sort of left unresolved with like the dad at the end is sort of like, oh, they just don't respect you for working. And like, he's sort of bitching about his job, which I love little touches like that. But then I think there might be a throwaway line about like, oh, we're talking about unionizing or something like that. So it does kind of give you those puzzle pieces of like, by all means, band together and take action, but take the right action.
Right. There's liberation and then there's oppression. And we have promoted a culture of oppression that has been sold as a form of liberation. And you can see that in like the small level of, middle management versus the entry level employee, or the colonizers versus the oppressed people. While the central conflict is this subtextual representation of how capitalism has failed people and has fragmented them and made them scared, and is not meaningfully addressing the pain that people are feeling on deep individual levels. The thing that makes this game work and feel so powerful is the work you do as the player to get to know your community and how you feel and get to love and understand each of these people on an individual level. And while you can't do all of that on a single playthrough, it is very impactful, the moments that you have with people. Every time I play this game, there's one thing I always have to do is I have to go on that little trip with Angus, who is this more soft-spoken character, where Greg, his boyfriend, is like this loud, hyperactive. He has stuff going on, but like is like this immediately like charismatic and interesting presence, and you're like, I want to hang out with this guy. This guy's fucking cool. Or like you feel immediately compelled to hang out with B because like there's this prickliness here, and I want to explore that and maybe remedy that. Angus is like, hey, I'm cool, I'm chilling, and you're able to have like surface level conversations with him. But when you go on that trip with him, you learn about his background that's only been like implied through like side conversations, and he opens up to you, and he says, he talks about his family, and his family situation is that he was horrifically abused. Both May and Angus's fathers were alcoholics at one point, but May's father got better, and while he was at one point abusive, he managed to overcome that. And that while there is like a deep dark past there, there was grace and forgiveness, and you see May's father now, and you don't see all of that cruelty that existed before. But Angus's father just remained abusive, and his mother was also this just deeply cruel person who refused to feed him and would lock him in, the pantry and just be cruel to him. And you're like, this person is deeply patient and kind and understanding and loving and is nothing but kind to you. And you reconcile that information with what you now know about him, and your heart shatters and it breaks. I always have to do that because it's like he says so many moving things.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many like meaningful things that just sort of cut into like what the heart of this game is beyond just like, oh, it's, humanity versus capitalism. It's humanity understanding humanity.
He says something like, I believe in a universe that does not care and people who do, or something like that, which is a great, great line from the game. But he's such a nurturer character. He's like the archetype of like the mother, like I'm going to feed you and just kind of talk you off the ledge, so to speak. Like, May is always sort of freaking out, and he's kind of the calm, serene, warm person that everybody can kind of feel comfortable with. And yeah, definitely one of, if B is my favorite character, I think Angus is my second favorite character. He's so cool.
Yeah. You're looking at constellations while having this conversation with him.
Yeah.
It becomes a spiritual conversation at a point. He says, like, the constellations, I don't believe that there's a whale out there, but I believe the stars exist, and people put the whale up there. We are good at drawing the lines through the space between the stars, and we'll find the patterns, and we'll pull our hearts and minds into it even if we don't mean to. So I believe in a universe that doesn't care and the people who do. And May says, pattern finders. I feel like a lot of people don't believe they found God, but like God found them. Like they were having bad times like you did. And Angus just replies, God never did find him. I was completely alone in the pantry, but a few years later, Greg did. So like the stars can stay up there and not give a shit about us, but this whale is pretty cool. And that is just like life-affirmingly heartbreaking, which is just kind of the tone the whole game has. And the implications of like what the universe is, and how that's can define his relationship with his parents, this all-encompassing thing that houses you but neglects to care for you, and it is up to other people fundamentally to care for you. I think that's what the game is about more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's another conversation that really, really sticks with me in terms of like what the game is about, and this one is a lot more labor focus, but it's you've gone into the crawl space in a playthrough before, right?
Yeah, upstairs in your house. Yeah,
it's not something that's immediately accessible, but it's also just a testament to how this game is structured, that this is completely missable. You may forget to look and see if the crawl space is accessible, but you go in there and you will find a tooth, and you want to know what the deal is with the tooth. And at some point in the game, you talk to your dad about it, May's dad, and ultimately it's revealed later that the deal with the tooth is, back in the day, these coal miners were trying to advocate for some rights for themselves, and things got intense, and the coal miners were getting agitated, and the boss was agitating them, and then the boss attacks one of them, punches them, and I think it's in the mouth, and the guy like loses teeth, and the coal workers retaliated by holding down their boss and ripping out his teeth one by one, and then keeping the teeth for themselves and giving like teeth to like everybody kept a tooth for themselves as like this reminder that they are stronger than their bosses, and that they are a community that should look out for themselves and be able to defeat the forces that are trying to overwhelm them. You talked about like your family. Your dad is planning on maybe unionizing, but he says it in like this very like soft way where he like goes to May and he's like, "Will you picket with me when we go on strike?" And it's just like this very human and intimate moment where it's not just about like, I'm going to stand up for myself and advocate for myself, but will you be there with me when the time comes? And that's just, God, what a phenomenal game.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is like it's one thing to like know about unionizing or like hold leftist ideals your whole life or most of your life or whatever. But when it comes time to actually do that work and get your hands dirty and join a union or unionize or go through like all the bullshit that a corporation will put you through when you decide to unionize, like it is a different thing. And, that like, will you pick it with me is like such a beautiful little intimate note. Like you said, it's a whole different thing when you actually have to do the work and deal with the consequences and the fears and the uncertainty and bully people in positions of immense power, all at once. It has its ups and downs and pros and cons, but I like the dad as a character, the way that he's sort of beaten down, world weary, but he's trying to get better and like you sort of reconnect with him through the course of the game. It's at the beginning you're sort of mad because he forgot to pick you up at the train station or the bus station or whatever. So
yeah, you overcome a lot of first impressions and you overcome a lot of information revealed about the past of him and other characters.
Yeah.
But you do a lot of reconciliation and meeting people in their time of need, or you see the humanity in people and you care for them, and there's a lot of forgiveness where B and May are able to reconcile, but it's obviously not like they're not perfect, like, hey, we're like girlfriends now, we know each other better now and we're able to reconcile. And depending on who you spend more time with over the course of the game, like the only real thing that changes in the ending is who do you have like the one-on-one conversation with after the cult situation happens. Is it going to be Greg or is it going to be B? But I do think that like on that particular playthrough, you will have such a deeper and closer relationship with that person as a player that whatever the outcome is, you will feel satisfied with it. And it will also be a thing where like you are curious about what it's like to be with the other person at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely need to like play some totally just like do whatever the opposite of my instinct is, playthroughs and see some of the other stuff. Cause I've done that Angus conversation, but it was like once a long time ago. So I've forgotten a lot of that stuff. And Greg, I've only done his branch like once. So
yeah, when I played the game for the first time, I was like immediately compelled to like explore the B stuff. So my first inning was with B.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is moving a bit along here. There's so much to this game. Obviously, we're not going to cover every single aspect of it. Is there anything you wish the game had done better?
I mean, it's so ambitious for such a small team, and it covers such scope that it's hard to say that. But at the same time, if I were to say anything, I guess the fact that all the mini games kind of feel similar, like the grabbing this or that without being seen, and just sort of like little simple puzzles. I feel like more of just variety there might have been welcome, but I mean, it's so hard for me to find things to complain about with this game because it's, I don't know. I like it holds certain things back and it leans into the limitations of kind of its text game structure and like 2D animation. I just love all that stuff, but I can see where other players might not get as much out of the game because they would want more, sort of spectacle and I don't know, fireworks, but I don't think any of that stuff is needed personally.
Right. I think it's a game where like you have to I think it's like it's such a personal experience that I personally wouldn't change anything about it, but I do understand people's issues with it in terms of how it's presented because it's so distinct.
Yeah.
But it's kind of one of those things, just like I guess you'll either like love or not love this sort of stuff about it. But I do think ultimately for me, this is a game that's greater than the sum of its parts. So like even if the grabby stuff is kind of perfunctory, I don't think about it as like, oh God, this thing again, just simply because like when I look at the whole thing holistically, it's just so much greater.
Yeah, it's such a like a complete text, like it's like a novel or a mini series or something. It's like this got this epic quality to it because it is so authentic and kind of blood soaked, so to speak. Like it's very from the heart. There's nothing kind of pretentious or guarded about it. It's very vulnerable and human and kind. Feels like a warm hug. I don't know. And then not in like a twee protective, training wheels sort of way either. It's got some like dark themes and real stuff that it gets into, but it's certainly cozy and warm-hearted.
Yeah, I do think it's a deeply empathetic game. We've been talking about Lynch a lot here. There's like a lot of stuff that's upsetting, but I do find just like deeply compassionate that it doesn't just disgust me. Firewalk with Me is very much that experience with me. And that's a much darker work than Night in the Woods, but I think that is a movie that's so full of compassion for Laura Palmer in a way that not even a TV show is able to be, that it's just like, this is a moving work. And it's certainly not a cozy comfort watch. I'm not comparing it to that, for example, but like,
yeah,
Evangelion, especially End of Evangelion, is a deeply painful experience, one that's clearly an expression of a lot of pain and a lot of work, but I do think it is a therapeutic and healing work in a lot of ways. And I do think that Night in the Woods approaches that kind of like therapeutic healing sort of thing. It's not escapism so much as it is a new perspective on a reality. And I think that is a moving thing for something in the interactive medium to be, when escapism is something that is constantly trying to be sold to you.
Mm-hmm.
So flaws, that's I guess a matter of perspective. We've talked a lot about the ways this game has impacted us, though. What is there any way this game has impacted you that you don't think we've covered already?
I think it changed the way I thought about what games could look like. I think it made me more open to trying sort of smaller games, more text heavy games, playing Twine games on itch or whatever, just kind of, something like all the cool little indie games that are coming out right now, like Dread Delusion and Summer House and Citizen Sleeper and all that kind of stuff. Like I think that Night in the Woods really opened me to those. I mean, writing for Kill Screen, by its very nature, I was covering a lot of small games, but I think Night in the Woods and my love for that game really shifted my kind of sensibilities. And I mean, you talk to some gamers and they're like, oh, my favorite games are Horizon Zero Dawn. And like, it's like the very like big, and that's cool. Like I like Last of Us 2. I like Red Dead Redemption. I like some of those games too, but some people only play that kind of thing and they don't want to see a 2D game like Pentiment, or they don't want to, or whatever the case may be,
Right.
So yeah, or Dredge, like it just kind of deepened my appreciation for the structure and the form of text games and narrative design. When I went to make my own original Twine game last year, I mean, I was like, what did Night in the Woods do to me that I loved so much? And, what ways did it frustrate me that made me want to replay it? Because once you like choose certain things, like there's no sort of like A, B, and C. It's like, no, you have to play the game again to get that other branch, right? So
yeah, it's certainly something where people would be compelled to be like, I want to be able to experience it all. And the games like this isn't numbers that you're putting into like a social system so you can get 100% happiness from all of your friends. This is here is this experience from one perspective and here is it from another. It's kind of the language of cinema. In like, you rewatch a movie even though like the outcome is the same, but you find new textures and angles from which to like experience a movie. And in the interactive medium, you're literally like exploring different facets of a game that's designed. It's just interesting to see a game that's like 2D explore that in a way that is more what feels to me like the feeling of like reapproaching a work versus like a game where you can get like 100% completion on a single playthrough because like you could just turn every corner. This is a game that's just like not promoting that kind of behavior. I've been thinking a lot about this game through recent gaming news with companies being shuttered or companies being merged and acquired. Yesterday, as of the time of this recording, there was news that came out, and this isn't even the actual like video game developing industry. This is like the media industry where IGN Entertainment acquired various publishers like GameIndustry.biz and Eurogamer, Rock Paper Shotgun, Dicebreaker, I think VG 24/7, and that feels scary. Where like because acquisitions has been like the big boogeyman of the gaming universe right now at the industry at large, and we don't know what the damage is yet as of the time of this recording, but there's been the word redundancies has already been put out there. So we're seeing us approaching a very we have crossed what we thought was like the event horizon multiple times uh, in the past several years in the industry, where it's like this is the big moment where things are, the point of no return for this phase of media or video games. But it keeps happening. And I find works like this to be moving because they don't inspire rot, they encourage change. And I do think that that is a lesson that we should take from it, because the moments of truth are here. And I do not want to sit with the idea of us just accepting the world's being destroyed so we can become another ghost town like Possum Springs. I don't want us to give into the despair and the hate and the cruelty. I don't want there to be, obviously like people associate gamers with chuds and Gamergate types, but there is a lot of compassion in this community too. And I hope that these voices become the spearheads for the next battle.
Yeah. Yep. A lot of young, sort of passionate people in the gaming industry, and it's easy to exploit and manipulate those people if you're the CEO of some big publisher. But the reality is that those people have kind of become radicalized in the last couple of years if they weren't already, and people are, unionizing left and right, and they're talking openly about issues of accessibility and their voices being heard, and sort of calling out bad behavior in a way that they wouldn't have had the courage to do 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I find that to be really encouraging. And I don't think that companies are gonna just keep getting away with like the same old tricks. And hopefully the union busting stuff that happens when they do these acquisitions and restructures as well. Hopefully, labor laws move in a better direction and side with the workers. And it's either that or everything is owned by Microsoft and Nintendo. And I don't think anybody wants that. So I think that all these different sort of indie studios, making like their weird little games and having those be really embraced and critically acclaimed is a good thing. But people got to eat too. So yeah, so it's an ugly, discouraging time. but the art is good and the people are good. So I'm optimistic.
People are terrible, but they're also the greatest thing that's ever happened. And I don't want to say like there's just things to despair over. Obviously, the news I just shared about like the video game journalism, the writings industry about all that, the media of it all, like that is obviously a problem that extends beyond the video game websites. But there's also positive people that are trying to forge ways forward, such as Aftermath, the publication founded by 4 former Kotaku writers, Nathan Grayson, Gita Jackson, Riley McLeod, Luke Plunkett. Those are people who are trying to shape their own destiny after this, side of the journalism industry has, negatively impacted them. And I do think that their story is inspirational, and I'm super excited to see how that shapes up. And if you have not heard of Aftermath and you do care about the state of the industry writ large, whether that is the journalism side of it, the developer side of it, I do encourage you to go for places like Aftermath, because not only is the writing good, but it does materially help the people who write for these companies. The same way that Night in the Woods is like this very authorial voice in an industry that is quickly homogenizing, I do find the work of all of these writers to be impactful.
Yeah. And I mean, that's really that's the problem with Google doing all the things it's doing. And, it's really hurting those kinds of voices at places like the big sites like Kotaku and Polygon. And like, if you see people complaining about the work being published at those sites or other sites that, have sort of like been hurting in recent years, like you really need to think of things in terms of like the macro, like the systems of Google, but also labor issues and things like that. And so it's really tricky to kind of, for somebody who's just Googling, Hellblade 2 reviews or whatever, to wrap their heads around that sometimes. But it's tough to have an authentic voice and just be yourself and write good work when Google wants to bury it or chew it up and spit it out as AI, nonsense. And it's definitely a weird, scary turning point.
Yeah, things are scary, but I do hope that we are prepared to, make the best world for each other. I wanted to share one more way this game impacted me, if you have the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I first played this video game, it was back in 2019, and I was struck by a lot of stuff about the game, but like I said, I think the thing that makes this game is the little moments, the interactions that are completely missable. Like you were talking about, the poet that you can just choose to interact with. For me, I think one of the interactions that inspired me the most was one with Donna, who is a Telesoft employee, which is the local call center at Possum Springs. It's a conversation you're not even engaging with. It's just one that you can listen in on as the days progress throughout the game. She's talking with a friend and saying in the early days, like, I can't keep working here. It's eating away at me. It follows me home. I have dreams where I'm at work. I sleep talk and I'm like, hey, this is Telesoft. How can I help you? And I said, oh my God, the game is talking to me, because I was working at Geico at the time at a call center job, my first job out of college. And I was working very strange hours. They kept changing the schedule on me, so I could never even get comfortable in the monotony of it. And it was that was the worst my mental health had ever been at that time, was those early months of 2019. And coming home late and being able to play a game for an hour or two, helped. But here I am playing this cute animal game, and then this very specific character who, again, missable conversation entirely, is complaining about how the call center job is destroying them. And then the days progress, and she's like, I'm quitting, I'm leaving. And then the whole, like, I left my job. And it's not like this whole, like, I'm free, my life is better now. Like, she's like, I think I'm just going to go work at the Ham Panther. But it's better than the call center job. And this game inspired me to quit my job, to not let me work in a place that was causing me misery just because at the time the pay was better than anything that I could imagine as a 22-year-old. And I lucked into finding a job almost immediately afterwards, so it wasn't like I was fun employed for any stretch of time, but it gave me the courage to realize I can just quit a job, and that it could actually benefit me more to leave a situation of stability and to look for something, anything else, than to just continue to make myself suffer in a place that I spend more than a third of my week at. So thank you, Night in the Woods. I quit.
It's become a bit of a meme on like Twitter and stuff, but it's just like, you can just quit, tell them to shove it. And if you're in a privileged position to do that once in a while, it really is just sometimes the only solution to a bad job, is just a change of scenery and different faces. And definitely been there. And sometimes there's just no fixing a really, really toxic job.
I chose not to have an attitude adjustment. I chose to have a job adjustment, and that worked out for me. So if any of you are suffering, know that a job is a place. Don't destroy yourself because you think this is your only option. Anyway, that's Night in the Woods. Anything else you want to say before we move on here, Alex?
No, I think we covered it pretty well. I think we kind of paid tribute to what's special about it. And it's just, it's one of those games that inspires people to make fan art and you know, pick up some markers and some pens. And I think it inspires people to go make games and just kind of, you know, give voice to those frustrations and that sort of quiet anti-capitalist rage. And Scott Benson as a voice, you know, I think that he has a lot of interesting things to say about like politics that, you know, maybe when I played the game in 2017, I didn't know how to articulate. You know, you can learn a lot by following somebody who cares about that sort of, you know, working class audience and that kind of different, you know, it's not Final Fantasy, right? It's not Halo. It's just everyday working class stakes. Carpenter Dan getting laid off. You know, I think there's value and beauty and poetry in those stories, and I wish that more games did that kind of thing.
A lot of games are about, I've talked the words power fantasy a bunch today. I think that the beautiful power of Night in the Woods is listening. It's a game about listening, and it's a game about learning through listening. And you can rush through the game if you choose not to listen to a lot of people, but I think you're depriving yourself of the core experience of the game by doing so. And I think that's the true nature of the game reveals itself when you listen. It's a radical act, listening. A lot of people just want to talk, but if you are willing to listen, you will learn so much about the world, and you will experience a game that will fundamentally change you. Because the thing that changed me about this game was completely optional. I chose to listen. This is a game about community, which ties into like the thing about listening. Community is just woven into the fabric of this game. This game was only made possible through the work of community. It was made by a handful of people. You know, Scott and Bethany are wonderful voices, but it was a crowd-funded game. This game was funded by other people. Other people made this game possible. The beautiful part about this game is that it's literally a part of what it preaches. Night in the Woods. Before I let you go, I like to make some space for our guests to make some recommendations, media that they feel may connect to Night in the Woods in some way, whether that is book, TV show, film, whatever. I know that you're a pretty well-read person. What would you recommend to listeners who enjoy Night in the Woods?
I think that I'd recommend, there's 3 movies and a novel that I wrote down. So the movie The Straight Story, which is another David Lynch. Nebraska's from like 2013. Sometimes I Think About Dying, which is from like last year. It's like just came out on digital, and hopefully we'll be getting a Blu-ray in the near future. And then there's a novel called The Devil All the Time, which is sort of like a multi-generational epic, you know, about a small like Ohio community. And there's like serial killers and like abusive preachers and all this horrible shit. But it's really beautifully written. It's sort of like that dark poetry that Nebraska, the Bruce Springsteen album, you know, that kind of, I don't know. The Devil All the Time by Donald Ray Pollock. Great novel. There was a Netflix movie that's pretty decent made out of it, but I think it's definitely a severe case of the novel was better. There are probably other books that I'm forgetting that would be really appropriate. I think the people should check out the short story writer Kelly Link.
Mm-hmm.
And the comic series The Goon is kind of one of those things of like the mundane crashing into the supernatural. I think that somebody who enjoys Night in the Woods would enjoy The Goon, or Lock and Key are a couple of favorites of mine.
I have a few recommendations myself really quickly here, and your recommendations are wonderful. Thank you so much. I love the movies you recommended. Nebraska, I think, is an underrated film. Nebraska is also a great album by Bruce Springsteen. You mentioned that one too. But quick video game recommendation. one of the things that we didn't talk about, I mentioned this at the beginning, but we didn't talk about it much, is that there's a game within the game that May can play on her computer called Demon Tower. It's a roguelike game that Adam Saltzman developed for Night in the Woods. It's another completely optional thing. I had a lot of fun with it. Adam Saltzman also developed this endless runner game called Canabalt that basically popularized the genre of endless runners and took over the app store for like years. Canabalt is just is a game that is completely free to play. Recommend checking it out if you just want to know about the lineage of a genre. You Zoomers and your Subway Surfers, if you want to respect your originator, just check out Canabalt. I definitely played it a little bit when I was supposed to be doing prep for this episode, and it's a game that is permanently a part of the video game section of the Museum of Modern Art. So it is a game that people have deemed historically important. So that's my quick video game recommendation. 2 movies. I mentioned it earlier this episode, The Last Picture Show by Peter Bogdanovich, a 1971 film. I do think that it cuts to the heart of a lot of the humans that have been abandoned by the world. Children that have to raise themselves because there's just a neglect that the previous generation has left behind, and people are struggling to find themselves within that. It's sort of like the consequences of neglect. It's a very wonderful movie. It's one of the early New Hollywood movies. If you love film and you've never engaged with the works of Peter Bogdanovich, that's one to start with. Great film. On a more upbeat note, one of my favorite films of all time is Fantastic Mr. Fox, which, like Night in the Woods, is about animals fighting against their oppressor in one way or another. The protagonist is also a kind of selfish person who overcomes their issues by learning to be part of a community. It's one of my favorite movies. It's also a fall time vibes movie, but like Night in the Woods, it's always a timely watch and you can enjoy it at any time of year. The reason that we talked about Night in the Woods today and not, necessarily in the fall is because these issues are ever present and you don't have to wait until the fall to learn to care for your community. Fantastic Mr. Fox is a fantastic film. I'm planning on getting a tattoo of the wolf. If you haven't seen it, you're depriving yourself. Last recommendation is actually an album. There's this folk band I enjoy the music of. They're called AJJ. They have a lot of empathetic folk music that comes from a place of hurt and compassion and love, and it's messy and it runs so many different emotions, but it's very moving. And I particularly recommend their second album from 2007, People Who Can Eat People Are the Luckiest People in the World. That is an album that is only like 25 minutes long. Like a lot of tracks are just a minute and a half to 2 minutes long. And it has a lot of emotions about humanity, but by the end, it's just like this deeply compassionate admission of love for your fellow man, and also sort of a plea for other people to understand one another. So yeah, People Who Can Eat People Are the Luckiest People in the World. That's my recommendation. So yeah, that is Night in the Woods. Thank you again for your time today, Alex. Before I finally let you go, please promote the hell out of yourself.
I have that first book, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic from Boss Fight, which is kind of a short making of where I interviewed people who worked at BioWare and LucasArts in the lead up to Knights of the Old Republic and during the development. And it sort of reflects on the legacy. And, I talked to a cosplayer and some game developers and voice actors and things like that. So, every copy sold feeds my children. So it's always kind of the main thing that I try to promote. You can find my work on like IGN or RogerEbert.com. And I have a little sci-fi text game that I published recently called Astoria, which is kind of, a sort of personal, embarrassing thing for me. The way Night in the Woods, you put every little bit of your heart in something and hope that it's coherent and says something meaningful. Who knows if it does? I have no idea. It's just a short little sci-fi thing that I in January when I was, going crazy because it was the winter time and all that. just sort of poured myself into that as a distraction. And yeah, it's on itch for free. And yeah, I'll have stuff coming out in the future in various books and things. So yeah, I'm on Twitter at Alex J Kane, Kane. And yeah, it was a lot of fun talking about Night in the Woods.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to have you on. I really appreciate your perspective. And it was really great to talk about such a meaningful video game experience, one that I completely identify with as well. So thank you for coming on. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of Select and Start. Once again, I'm your host, editor, and promoter, Keifer. If you enjoyed this episode, please give the show a positive review wherever you're listening to this. Engagement helps the show, and your feedback will improve it. And if you want to get more engaged, give the show a follow on Twitter at SelectPodStart. If you have thoughts about Night in the Woods or any other games we've discussed, send a DM or leave a comment, and I will gladly read it on the show. You can also support me on Patreon. If you pledge at least $1 a month, you will get early access to new episodes, such as this one, as well as extended episodes with exclusive content. You could have heard more of this episode. That's on patreon.com/Keifer's Corner. You can find a link to that and the rest of my projects in the description of this episode. Select and Start is on the Moonshot Network, which is supported by its own Patreon. Find out more on moonshotpods.com. The art for the show is made by my best friend, Avery Ott. You can follow him on social media with the handle at Avery Robin Ott. That's AVRY Robin OTT. The theme song was composed by Mike Petrie. You can check out the links in the description for their work as well as Alex's. All right, I think that's it. GREGG rules, okay?
Out here in Amish, smoking big doinks in Amish.